Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today we're going to be talking about a bunch of recent, let's call it activity, a flurry of activity around the Xbox IP, and how it's a lot of rumor mill stuff, and yeah, we'll talk about it. Before we do that, though, if you guys could do me a favor, please like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done it before, and check out all my social media stuff in the description. I've got Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, Spreadshirt, Travel Channel, etc. I appreciate the support on those platforms. Thank you so much. Let's get on to it. So, and I say that especially in this video because this is probably one of the only ones where the algorithm actually appreciates that I'm talking about modern stuff as opposed to what I'm more passionate about. Okay, so first, this is obviously a discussion video. There's really nothing else to talk about. There's nothing to display, hence we're using the nice microphone. But also, if you're new to the channel, welcome. Thank you for being here. And what you probably don't know about me if you're brand new is I really don't like to engage in rumor mill stuff. I find it intellectually insulting to myself and to, frankly, everybody. But unfortunately, a lot of people really just don't always know what's a rumor and what's true, and I'm here to try and offer a little bit of insight. Now, full disclosure, I don't work for Microsoft. I have no idea what's absolutely true, but I can paint a picture based on what I think is happening relative to their own history and what we've been talking about forever. So if you have been watching me for quite some time, you know that I have been saying for many years, like over 10, the inevitable direction that the Xbox brand will go in is some sort of digital ecosystem, a Steam competitor. And often people cite this as like a joke saying, oh, you can't beat Steam, they're too powerful. That doesn't stop GOG or Epic or anybody else from competing. There's a difference between winning and competing. Microsoft, very clearly, that's where they're going. Now, we're going to talk history and all that and how we get to that conclusion in a minute. But first, let's address the most obvious. Where this all comes from right now, the rumor mill stuff that everybody's like talking about, is a couple of different factors. One, there was a big story the other day about, oh, Xbox is getting ready to pull out of consoles. It's almost over. Microsoft debunked that within a day, citing specifically that they are continuing to work with AMD and cites AMD's their relationship there as proof that hardware is being developed. So relax, Microsoft is not leaving the Xbox brand yet. Keyword yet. I do think they will at some point, but we're not there yet. Anywho, so you don't have to worry about that in the short term. And then a lot of stuff around Game Pass price has essentially doubled. It just and obviously console hardware has also gone up in price. So I thought, rather than be like, guys, Microsoft might be leaving Xbox, because I don't respect videos like that at all, I wanted to address this not so much from a rumor mill, maybe it's happening sort of perspective, but let's articulate the history of this, why it actually would make sense, and what would be the fallout if something like this actually did happen. That's more the purpose of this video. So hopefully you learn something and hopefully you enjoy this. Now, we need to start where it all begins. Why is Microsoft even in consoles to begin with? Why are they here? Why do they do this? Because every year we hear these same stories about, oh, they spent too much on this, that didn't work out for them, blah, blah, blah. If they were any other company, they would have gone belly up years ago, or they would have given up on consoles a long time ago, but they're still here. And they can only do that because they are literally Microsoft that has the liquidity to be able to sustain that much loss. So let's start with the origin point. They got into consoles, as I'm sure a lot of you know, back in 2001 with the launch of the original Xbox. But I have told this story in the past, and I talk about all these type of updates with Xbox and with PlayStation and Nintendo, everybody, on my podcast, which sorely is underviewed. If you guys listen to that, you would not be surprised by any of this stuff. I've been talking about how Game Pass will inevitably get more expensive and everything over there for years. But anyway, okay. So the core reason that Microsoft got into consoles in the first place that's always cited is that they saw Sony taking over the living room. Partially true, yes, but this is going to sound ridiculous to people who are younger than me. I am a millennial. I am 38. I remember this. So PCs, as we think of them now, an integral part of the home. Not having one is like not having a shower. It's just bizarre. But in the 1980s is when that technology, the concept of the personal computer, the idea of having a computer in your own home first came into origin. And it really did not take off as like a average thing until the late 90s. Now, I remember when I was a kid in elementary school, kindergarten, all that, in the early 90s, our teachers would actually ask us, because we were doing homework or whatever, we had to bring stuff in. They were like, who at home has a computer? And like maybe one or two kids in like 1992 or 1993 could raise their hand, because they did. Their parents were like, wealthy, or their parents' company had provided one, or whatever the situation was. And so it was rare back then. And by the late 90s, it became the average. And they were still asking us that question all the way until middle school. Like, who has a computer at home? And like by the year 2000, it was kind of a silly question to still be asking, because obviously everybody had a computer. Now, keep in mind what that timeline is. In the early 90s, nobody has a computer. By like 92, 93, only 8 years later, the original Xbox comes out. The concern for Microsoft at the time was that as consoles were starting to take off, they were concerned of what would happen to the PC as we think of it. The PC, in their mind, could have been considered a fad, something that came and went, like the BlackBerry or something like that. Like, yeah, we still have phones, obviously, but, as a specific special device, it could have gone the way of the dinosaur or the typewriter or whatever. They were just concerned about that possibility. And I will tell you, as someone who remembers the 90s quite well, your average PC user at the time was either extreme enthusiasts who really were into like, I'm going to see what DOS does, or you just had people who were like, I'm going to check out this World Wide Web thing. And that was, about all they could do with it. Maybe they'd play some games on it, and that's it. The game part. That was what their big concern was. They basically wanted PCs to remain relevant, but they were concerned that home consoles might knock out one of the biggest reasons that people at the time had home computers: gaming. And that Sony in particular was the number one threat to that, hence the taking over the living room thing. So what they ended up doing was partnering with Sega, as I'm sure you guys know. If you don't know, well, they briefly made some software for the Dreamcast. They got somewhat involved in that. You can see compatible with Windows CE written right on the Dreamcast. And they even had a discussion with Sega about supporting the Xbox, eventually what would become the Xbox, together. There was a possibility that Microsoft would continue to support the Dreamcast, and then the next console would be the two of them working together. None of that panned out. But the point is, Microsoft had ingratiated themselves into the video game industry through Sega. And then Sega, of course, had to exit for their own reasons. Now, Microsoft did not want to make a game console. They are not a hardware company. Even now, that's still just really not their thing. The vast majority of their income comes from Windows. But if they had a video game console and they were successful in that arena, no matter what that success costs, and I mean that in financial terms because boy has it, then they could control the direction of that industry. That was the key. That's what they wanted. So the Xbox had to get in there just to make sure that consoles were considered a separate thing from home computers, and to make sure that the concept of the home computer was not replaced by consoles. And I know, sitting here in the future of 2025, we all find that silly and hilarious, but that was the mentality at the time. They obviously succeeded in that goal, and it cost them $4.4 billion. That's the net negative of the original Xbox. That's how much it cost by the time they stopped that system. They did not make money on that hardware. They lost it. But that fee was happily paid to preserve the empire that is Windows, which must endure. So they could have stopped right there. Now the trajectory of the industry was separated from computers just like they wanted. Everything was fine. But then they looked at it and said, what if we actually have something here? What if we could actually be successful in this video game thing? And you saw certain expansions of that. Obviously, they tried Windows Live to make Windows more of a Xbox ecosystem-friendly thing, which they would eventually nail down with Game Pass. But the Xbox 360, they said, we can do this. And the Xbox 360 was actually a pretty big success, even in Japan, and I've told that story many times, at least initially, until Microsoft came up with some stupid ideas that killed it in Japan. And then, of course, infamously, the Red Rings of Death fiasco overall in the whole world basically ate up their lunch. So that system didn't end up making money. But the logic going into the Xbox One was, well, we almost did it had it not been for a hardware issue. We would have done it. So let's try it again. But by that time, you now had Don Matrick in charge. And famously, he's the one who came out on stage back in 2013 with the whole TV sports, online DRM, Connect mandatory, blah, 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 all that horrible incident. The one event that basically killed the Xbox brand right there. From there, it has never recovered to this day. That stigma has stayed with them forever. And it has truly, truly hurt them. But ever since that moment, we have existed in that same Xbox ecosystem. Now, once they kicked him out and replaced him with Phil Spencer, Phil's job was effectively to try and course correct the brand. And what we think has been happening over the years is that he'll have an idea and then Microsoft will push back on it a little. And it's just the two of them kind of like weaving this ship together, right? Trying to pilot it. Each one has a different handle on the stick, you know? And so some ideas work, some ideas don't. And sometimes the money is just too significant. And the goal becomes, what are we doing this for? Why are we hemorrhaging so much money anymore? And the common consensus now is that Phil Spencer and the Xbox team created Xbox Game Pass to appeal to Microsoft's upper echelon. Microsoft, again, is not a hardware company. But if you can convince Microsoft that Xbox Game Pass can become the Windows of gaming, where it becomes the essential one-stop location that dominates the market. Like, say what you want about Windows. There is competition in the form of Mac OS. There is obviously Linux and Ubuntu and a few other services, but like they're token, they're ancillary compared to the success rate and installation rate, adoption rate, if you will, of Windows. And that was the end game goal with Game Pass. And they thought, if we get to that point, it'll pay for itself, no matter what happens. And they kept on that logic. They decided to just support indefinitely with a blank check. Just keep going in on the hardware, keep going in on whatever changes are necessary, keep going in on the software. And one thing we can do to start absorbing other companies, that way we can have their IPs and the brand becomes even bigger and more successful. And that's how you got the Bethesda merger and eventually the Activision merger. Now, again, I've talked about this in my podcast at length, but the Activision merger is really the straw, if you will, even though it's a pretty big straw, that broke the camel's back on this whole thing. That was like $56 billion. I mean, it was massive. And to the point where you could no longer, Microsoft upper echelon couldn't like raise an eyebrow and just ignore it anymore. They really were like, huh? How's that going to pay off? Now, where that comes full circle is we're finally realizing, at least everybody else is, I guess, how unsuccessful Game Pass actually is from a financial perspective. The original idea with Game Pass was obvious. It was, you'll have this subscription service and all these games are up there. And as long as you're subscribed to it, you can just download whatever you want, play it. And then when you don't want it anymore, you just delete it and just come and go as you please. For the consumer, it was considered a huge win because it seemed like, you know, you were getting all these gaming experiences for very, very cheap. But Microsoft was the one really eating it on that. And then developers were a mixed bag. So I've described this before as a triangle where there's three parties always involved. And when it comes to economics, and at best, two can win and always one must hurt. So in this case, developers did well, at least third-party ones. Consumers did well, but Microsoft had to hurt. And if Microsoft wants to do well, they'd have to increase prices. That's good for developers. It is not good for consumers. Like, somebody always has to lose. And if they made it too difficult, you know, to use or too expensive to get into, whatever, then developers would hurt because then they couldn't use it, etc. Like, there's always, in economics, it's a triangle. Okay, so the way that Game Pass fundamentally works, the reason it can be so cheap is because, or was cheap, let's keep that there, was because Microsoft was basically just funding it themselves. They were basically just like a tax subsidizing it, if you want to think of it that way. They were subsidizing its existence because the subscription fee is not nearly enough to offset the damages. Now, this is proven time and time again because of price raises and because of individual game losses. Like Call of Duty Black Ops 6 now is estimated to have lost $300 million in revenue simply because it was on Game Pass. And Game Pass itself just basically doubled all its prices because it had no choice but to try and offset some of the damages. Now, the way the Game Pass model works was if Microsoft internally owned a development studio or owned a company or whatever it was that they would basically force the game on Game Pass. That's fine. It's their property. They can do that. Now, when a game went on Game Pass and also had traditional sales, where it's digital sales, physical sales, what have you, inevitably there are people, lots of them, that say, well, I do want to play that game, but it's on Game Pass. I already subscribed to Game Pass for like $13 a month. I'm just going to play it there, and then I'm not going to play it again, so I don't need to go out and buy it. Repeat that in bulk, and there's a lot of people that didn't end up buying that game. So when that game, whatever said game is, they look at the sales of it. You know, the people ignoring all the Game Pass downloads, because those don't count. Everybody who actually sat down and bought it, either physically or digitally, they look at those numbers and they go, well, this game didn't sell very well. No sequels, no company is going to, you know. And that's how we saw so many of these closures from Microsoft over the past few years, because these companies are getting punished for what Game Pass is doing to their game. It's unsustainable. Meanwhile, you have third-party developers. They would have no financial incentive to actually put games on Game Pass, except Microsoft, once again, subsidized it and guaranteed a certain amount of sales. So I'm making these numbers up completely, but just is how it works for argument's sake. Let's say Sega, for example, my beloved Sega, had a new game coming up, and they were like, okay, our target sales goal is 1 million copies, okay? Microsoft says, hey, that's going to be a cool game. Put it on Game Pass. And so Sega's like, well, we don't make any money off Game Pass because that's your subscription service, so we have no reason to go put a game over there. Microsoft will say, how many are you trying to sell? They're like, we're trying to sell 1 million copies. That's our ideal goal. Microsoft goes, all right, we will automatically give you 700,000 copies sales. Like, they guarantee that money, like an NBA contract or something. They just guarantee a fixed amount of money. So then Sega goes, okay, so 70% of our goal is automatically reached just by agreeing to that. Yes, there will be a lot of customers that will not buy our game now because they'll just get it on Game Pass, but will we still get the other 30% from traditional sales? And that's the dance they do with each other. And a lot of times this is actually better for third-party developers, because in most cases you still will. Because there's going to be guys like me, lots of us, who don't have Game Pass because we don't want it, because we actually want to own the game. We don't want to rent it. But again, that's Microsoft just losing money hand over fist. Now, because it's possible you go well beyond those sales, it's also possible you fall well under. You know, maybe they were aiming for 1 million sales, and the game came out and it sold like 50 copies. Wow, what a flop. Oh, thankfully we had that 70% guarantee over there. So this isn't going to hurt nearly as bad as it otherwise would have. You know what I mean? That's the dance of economics. And Microsoft has increasingly proven it's just not willing to play this anymore. And I don't blame them. Like this is financially irresponsible and completely insane. So while the rumors of them just quitting Xbox are not true, not yet, it is inevitable that changes are coming. And that's why price increases are occurring. Now, that's one side of things. People also talk about the hardware. The hardware is another one, because we've also seen price increases in hardware, which everybody looks at and is just baffling, because the traditional model for a game console is it would come out at a certain retail rate. You would occasionally get sales or deals or whatever, but normally over the course of the console's lifespan, there's just hardware cuts on the price. Usually the developer or manufacturer tries to find ways to make it cheaper, and they also just sell it cheaper as the technology gets older, et cetera, so they get the adoption rate to be higher and higher. This generation has been baffling to most people because the PlayStation 5 has gone up in price. The Xbox hardware has gone up in price. This is mostly baffling to Americans because this has actually happened in other countries for quite some time. Famously, this happened with the Canadians all the way back in the early PS4 days. Now, the reasons for this, you really actually can't pin too much on the companies. Like, this is not really Sony or Microsoft's or Nintendo's fault. This is external factors that we're going to sort of dabble in, because I think it's important for you to understand them as the intelligent individual that you are. You deserve a more well-rounded understanding of economics. The current state of why things are like that is people always, oh, Microsoft's greedy. Trust me, they ain't greedy. Like, they want money. That's the sole function of any corporation. That's true. But if they were greedy, they would have, as you put it, given up on this 30 years ago. They would not still be subsidizing this at a massive loss. So the reason they have to increase the prices is multifactored. and it's all geopolitical related events around the world that they have nothing to do with. One, the current state of economies throughout the world, inflation in particular, is a very bad problem in a lot of countries. In the US, it's bad. It's much worse in other countries. We're actually doing kind of all right compared to most people. That's one. But also external factors like a certain military activity existing in Eastern Europe between a really big bear country and a smaller one with a blue and yellow flag that I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Now, you might be like, what does that have to do with my Xbox? So a fun fact about chip production. Inside your Xbox is a series of chips and electronics and things. The process for that to be created, the supply chain that actually put that thing together and made it show up at your house, wasn't just all the pieces existed in nature in China and they plucked them from the chip tree and they put it together and there's your Xbox. It has to be chemically created from different sources and combined. Chips primarily come out of Taiwan. That is the number one place, TMSS, I believe it is. They primarily create most of the world's chips along with the United States, and the Chinese produce like low-end chips, not the stuff you would put in an Xbox. But those chips all have to be produced. Chips are created from a series of different components, one of which is very significant. It's called neon. It's a type of gas you have to manufacture. It doesn't really exist in nature, except in maybe very small amounts, and it has to be created and put into chips. That's how you physically produce them. Now, why does that matter? History lesson. At the end of the Cold War, well, in the dying days of the Soviet Union back in the late 80s, Mikhail Gorbachev recognized, correctly so, that neon was an important thing for production. And so he spent a ton of money in the Soviet Union to get neon facilities created. So these facilities take years to produce, to get online, to function, and then actually extract resources, a lot of which is in certain blue and yellow country that need to be, put online and actually create neon. And as soon as it was up and running, the Soviet Union collapsed. And as soon as it collapsed, the rest of the world's like, oh yeah, electronics are pretty cool. Like 91 was a big year in the world history because a lot of things changed. China started becoming the world's factory. The Soviet Union's entire supplies were all suddenly, hey, the West, let's talk to you. We'll sell our stuff. And the United States stood alone as a superpower. Like, it was a big year. The only reason that matters is neon was suddenly readily available to the rest of the world. So that was cool. The Russians effectively were willing to sell it to everybody. And so the rest of the world did not feel a need to spend money on infrastructure to make neon. Do you understand where I'm going with this? As soon as certain events started, they could no longer produce it and sell it to the rest of the world. And because they can't do that, it's much harder to create these things. And because it's much harder to create these things and you have to build out new infrastructure to do it, that has a sunken cost. That sunken cost has to come from something. And it comes from your Xbox and your PlayStation and all that becoming more expensive to pay that, in addition to other things that, like I said, related to Taiwan specifically, and not to mention economics and meaning inflation. And certain self-imposed tariffs and other things like that. All these different factors that are basically coming together to make everything more expensive. All of that has nothing to do with Microsoft. They're just a victim of it like everybody else. So I guess where I'm going with all this is we are seeing a lot of stories right now about, Xbox might be getting out. Various retailers are no longer selling Xbox hardware. Obviously, Microsoft is cutting more and more and more on physical hardware and physical software, meaning physical editions of games. These are all basically true things. At some point, Microsoft is going to drop out of hardware, but they're not there yet. I do believe they have one more generation in them of at least local hardware. Now, I don't personally think that said local hardware will have a disk drive. I could be wrong. It's very possible. I would love to be wrong. But as we see all this additional evidence, they truly just want Xbox Game Pass to be the Windows of gaming. And they have tried it in multiple arenas. The end game seems so obvious. It's just the transition is really difficult. You want that software on not only your own hardware, but you want it on PCs, you want it on phones, you want it on tablets, built into televisions. I mean, Game Pass built into TVs is a thing. And even getting it to work on things like PlayStation hardware, possibly even Nintendo hardware. Let's keep in mind that Microsoft is oddly cooperative with its direct competitors. not only in the PC space, but in the gaming space. I mean, that was one of the conditions, especially of the Activision merger, is they had to allow Call of Duty to exist on other platforms, et cetera. So I genuinely feel that the plan here has not changed. It's just, let's get Game Pass on everything. Let's keep working on that. The problem is financial reality is hitting harder and harder. And so they've just had a bad few days dealing with all this as the public has to absorb this and get used to it. Xbox Game Pass will inevitably go up. Like I said in that triangle, somebody has to always lose. And it's going to be you. Now, the only resistance to this, if you care about that, is to continue to support physical editions. But I've been harping on that for 15 years. And it's fortunately, at least physical movies are making more of a comeback. That's kind of nice. If you want ownership of your games, granted, a lot of physical editions these days are very butchered. I'll grant you that. You got to support that. But that said, none of the three game companies right now, the manufacturers, are really like healthy bastions of physical media. So let's not pretend that they are. But I don't know. It depends on what you want out of your experiences and what you want to support. You're your own person. You make your own decisions. But I'm just saying that Xbox, I genuinely believe, is coming up to the end. Like at least one more generation of what we know to be hardware. I don't think it'll have a disk drive or anything like that, but I do think it'll be localized hardware. With the eventual end game of continuing this idea of just integrating, making Game Pass synonymous with gaming, irreplaceable, essential, mandatory even, much like Windows is, even though it is not technically mandatory, much like Windows isn't, there are alternatives, you will be severely limited. I guarantee you that's the end game, but much like Windows, they just had to find ways to make it work. And that's where we are. I'm not defending this practice. I actually kind of find it monopolistic and it really bothers me, but if we want to wax inane here, I do not think Microsoft is getting out of gaming as a collective concept anytime soon. Hardware is a different matter, but gaming as a collective concept anytime soon. But if they were, man, could you imagine the chaos that would cause? Like ignoring all the obvious Xbox flaws that would emerge, like games not working, everything going offline, whatever it is. But just like the amount of IP and content that they own that would be presumably up to fire sale and the ripple effects that would have throughout that industry. I mean, knocking out one of the biggest pieces, like, ooh, that would be bad. I don't think we're there. I don't think that's happening. But I do want to say that I really hope you guys understand where this is going. And that's just prepare for the all digital Xbox future sooner rather than later. Your Xbox as you know it will continue to work, but be less and less surprised every time you hear about, oh, such and such country is no longer going to have physical editions of Xbox stuff. Last time I checked, the Xbox Series X with a disk drive wasn't even being manufactured anymore. Although I think that might be changing, which is good. But like, it kind of sucks. And of course, Nintendo didn't make it any better with the way game key cards work on their system. And inevitably, the PS6 will probably have an external disk drive that's considered optional. I think just be prepared for all that. I think that for as much as people are unhappy with this current generation, the next one ain't going to be any better. But yeah. Anyway, that's depressing enough. So I think we'll wrap it up there. If you guys can do me a favor, please like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before, and check out all my social media stuff in the description. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, Spreadshirt, Travel Channel, etc. I appreciate the support on those platforms. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all later.